Did you ever take an empty space and turn it into a sacred place? You can make it happen anywhere, and that's the meaning of an empty chair. There is an empty chair, but no one sitting there. There's a feeling in the air, nothing in the empty chair. Eliyahu, we will wait for you. Eliyahu, Hanavi, Eliyahu, we sing this song to you. Eliyahu, Hanavi, Eliyahu, 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 Hanavi,
There is only one religion, the religion of love. There is only one caste, the caste of humanity. There is only one language, the language of the heart. There is only one God. He is omnipresent.
Sairam. Welcome to the Sri Satya Sai Global Council series, The Essence of All Religion is One. This will be a journey of exploration of the great faiths of the world done via panel discussions featuring followers of Bhagwan Sri Satya Sai Baba. A core teaching of Baba is that the essence of all religions is one. This fundamental commonality among all religions comes out when they are understood properly, using the principles of love, service to fellow man, and unity. These are all promoted within all of these great traditions. Sai Baba has emphasized the positives of each religion and taught that criticizing other paths to try and promote one's own path was counterproductive and actually against true spirituality. This sentiment is captured in a discourse Baba gave on the 23rd of July, 1989. Quote, "Realize that the essence of all religions is one. Don't enter into futile controversies or criticize other religions. It is fraught with danger. When you attack another religion, you are really guilty of assailing your own religion. Therefore, show your reverence to everyone." So each segment in this series will focus on one great tradition as understood by panelists who are either born into it or raised in a community of that faith. And we'll highlight how each of their appreciation and love for their own tradition grew when they started to understand it through the lens of Sai Baba's teachings.
అల్లా ఎంచు మహమ్మదీయులు,
Mohammedans call him Allah.
జెహోవా ఎంచు సత్క్రైస్తవులు,
Good Christians call him Jehovah.
పుల్లబ్జాక్షుడనంచు విష్ణు వైష్ణవులు,
And Vaishnavites call him as Fullabjaksha.
శంభో ఎంచు సేవులు సదా.
Shaivites call him Shambho.
ప్రలాభమున కొలువ అందరికీ ఐశ్వర్యమును, దయను, ప్రేమను అందించి కాపాడేటువంటి దేవుడు ఒక్కడే అని భావించుడి.
We may give him any number of names, extol him as Allah, Jehovah, Vishnu and Shiva, but yet the same God confers plenty,
దైవం
prosperity,
ఒక్కడే.
compassion. God is one.
పేర్లు అనేకంగా ఉంటున్నాయి.
He has many names.
ఒక్కొక్కరు దానిని గురించి ఒక మతంగా స్థాపించుకుంటూ వచ్చారు.
And every religion has got its own
ఈ మతములు
comprehension.
వేరు కాదు.
In fact, they are different. not different.
మతములన్నీ వేరు, మార్గము ఒక్కటే.
Though religions differ, the path is one.
వస్త్ర భేదము వేరు, వస్తువు ఒకటే.
The yarn is one, though cloth seems to be different.
శృంగారములు వేరు, బంగారం ఒక్కటే.
Jewels are different, but gold is one.
పశుల వన్నెలు వేరు, పాలు ఒకటే.
The color of the cows is different, but
జీవ
milk
జంతువులు
is
వేరు,
one.
జీవుండు ఒక్కటే.
Though there are many individuals, but the indweller
జాతి
is same.
నీతులు వేరు, జన్మం ఒకటే.
There may be many of the beings, but the birth is same.
కనుకనే ప్రతి మానవుడు కూడాను తన తత్వాన్ని తాను గుర్తించుకుంటే సత్యము స్మరణకు వస్తుంది.
Therefore, if everyone investigates and inquires to know his true nature, he can experience truth.
Hello everyone. Welcome to the second session of our series, The Essence of Religion is One. We are very privileged and fortunate to have the distinguished members on our panel today. They're ardent devotees of Sri Satya Sai Baba and also members of the Jewish faith. Without any delay, I will go ahead and introduce our first panelist, Ilana Marks. Ilana is a writer, international lecturer, and a radio talk show host in Boston, then later in Sarasota for 14 years as well. Over the years, she has interviewed hundreds of authors, musicians, celebrities, and politicians. Ilana recently wrote and directed a feature film called Mind the Gap, a psychological spiritual comedy, which came to her in a dream. She's creating a children's animation book and game series, which teaches about helping others, love for our earth, healthy eating, understanding other religions, countries, and cultures. She has worked and lived nearly in 5 continents and can speak 4 different languages. Ilana's first experience with Satya Sai Baba happened when Satya Sai Baba came to her in a life-changing dream in 1999, prompting her to visit Whitefield and Puttaparthi in 2001. The next member on our panel today is Stanley Wetschler. Stan was raised in a Reformed Jewish tradition. As he left home to pursue his education and career, he had gradually lost touch with his connection with the temple. Dr. Wetschler practiced internal medicine for 27 years in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, where he was the medical director for the largest hospital-owned home care agency in the country. He was also served on the board of family hospice and palliative care as well. In 1999, he received a diagnosis of stage 4 cancer and was told that he only had 2 months to live. Shortly after, through a set of Sai incidences, the stage was set for a series of the most remarkable events to unfold. Along with his wife Jane, who was the catalyst for what would eventually result in a major transformative process, they both have embarked on a long journey with Swami's teachings of love and service to become the essence of their lives. Stan became boarded in holistic medicine in 2005, where he was appointed the director of the Dean Ornish Heart Disease Reversal Program. It was an honor for him to serve as an internist at the General Hospital in Puttaparthi on multiple occasions as well. In 2016, Stan and Jane moved to the mountains of Asheville, North Carolina, where they assumed leadership roles in the Satya Sai group and helped establish the Leda Home Project, which currently serves disadvantaged children. In fact, this project in 2020 was designated by the Psi national team as one of the Adopt a Community initiatives. Jane and Stan have been speakers at several Psi centers, and they have conducted numerous workshops on health, wellness at the annual Mid-Atlantic regional retreats as well. Stan has even served as the president of the Pittsburgh Psi Center in Pennsylvania. And now introducing our final panelist, Ilya Rapoport. Ilya has first learned of Satya Sai Baba in 1995 through a miraculous event and subsequently had joined Baba's fold. He has been facilitating the study circle for the Atlanta Psi Center for about 10 years now. He's currently serving his second term as vice president of the Atlanta Psi Center. Baba has communicated with him in many ways, and Ilya has many wonderful stories to tell. By profession, Mr. Rapoport is a telecommunications engineer and worked for companies such as AT&T, Bell Laboratories, and Johnson Controls. He holds 2 master's degrees and has numerous prestigious professional designations, such as PMP, RCDD, NTS, and etc. He currently works as an associate principal in a technology company, and Ilya loves the outdoor activities. He has scaled over 40 mountains in serious technical climbing situations and has run over 20 marathons. After moving to Atlanta in 1989, Ilya has participated in services in the local synagogues, where he was honored by performing a lifting of the Torah scroll, a ritual on high holidays on several occasions. He has given several short talks on Judaism and unity of faith in the Psi community as well. While his official last name is Ilya, in the Psi circles, he goes by ILYA, which stands for I Love You All. So now that you all are familiar with our panelists, let's jump right into the questions. So let's start off with Ilya. So Ilya, can you start us off by speaking on the origin and history of Judaism?
Hi, Ram, everyone. Origin and history of Judaism. About 4,000 years ago, God visited a man by the name Abraham. He lived in the city of Ur in Mesopotamia, which is now southern Iraq. And God offered him a covenant saying, Abraham, I'll be your God, you'll follow my command, I'll give you good land, and you, your family and your nation will grow big time. So Abraham agreed to that, and God instructed him to go to the remote land, which is now Israel, called Canaan back then. And that's on the Mediterranean Sea by Egypt. It was a long and difficult journey for Abraham and his family. But he reached the land, they settled there, they lived there for a long, long time until time came and the famine came. There is no rain, nothing grows, the river dried up, they had nothing to eat and nothing to feed to their livestock. So they had to go to Egypt. And so they did. You know, they went to Egypt. They were first received very favorably. They had comfortable life there. But things changed, and as what they call themselves Hebrew people grew in numbers, the Pharaoh, the local ruler, was scared that they will have too much force and influence. So he decided to enslave them and made them to make pyramids for him. So that continues for a long time, but it became so unbearable that they could not bear it any longer. And they prayed and prayed to God to help them out. God heard the prayer, and he instructed the man by the name Moses to lead Hebrew people out of Egypt and back to the promised land. So Moses came to Pharaoh, the ruler, and told him, God spoke to me, you need to let my people go. Oh, Pharaoh did not agree. Oh, God wanted to show him who makes the rules. So he sent 10 plagues to Egyptians, and there were terrible trials and tribulations to them. So after the 10th one, Pharaoh agreed, saying, okay, take your people, you guys can go. I had enough trouble here. So Moses leaving Egypt with all the Hebrews, they reach Red Sea, and now they see, Egyptian army is following them because Pharaoh changed his mind and now wants them back. But God instructed Moses to go through the sea, and as they went into the water, he opened the waters, and there was a corridor with walls of water on each side. So Hebrews safely passed on to the other side, and Egyptians did not. So they were free people once again. They were wandering in the desert for about 40 years until they could reach the land, promised land. So no people who were born in slavery would reach, this land of free. While they were in desert, though, Moses went to Mount Sinai to pray, and God appeared to him once again in invisible form and gave him the law. He said, Moses, here's the law I'm given to Hebrew people. You need to follow it. And in the law, there were 10 commandments. These 10 commandments are now in Jewish tradition, the Christian tradition, and so forth. The base of Western civilization nowadays. So Moses took the law, presented to his people, and everyone had to obey. So they went, after 40 years in desert, they went to his promised land, which is now Israel, and they built the temple, and they lived prosperously and they lived happily there, until, the land was conquered by the neighbor, Syrian Empire there. So that spelled a lot of trouble. They were dispelled from the land. But after some time, 40,000 of Hebrews were allowed to come back and build the temple again, the second temple of Solomon. So they did, and they lived there again for some time until Romans came and they destroyed that temple except for one wall, Western Wall. And again, Jews had to leave their land, and they lived in many countries which are called diaspora, so including the United States now, but many other countries as well. And through all their history, there were a lot of tests, there were a lot of troubles, there were a lot of tribulations, but they kept their covenant with God, that God is their Lord, and the Jewish people are his people, and they follow the law, no matter what comes. That's in short introduction into Jewish religion.
Thank you, Ilya, for sharing the story. That's very inspiring and very insightful, and it's so humbling to see, how many challenges everybody had to go through to be where we are today. So, thankful so much to, God and everybody who was able to help us out in that sense. So thank you again for sharing the story. I really appreciate that. So now, Stan, so can you tell us about the main personages of the Jewish Bible?
Well, thank you. I found it to be very interesting that if you do a Google search for the main figures in the Old Testament, one of the first hits is an article by a writer, Peter Kearney, which appeared in the Frederick News Post, and it was entitled, "The Old Testament is About Jesus Christ." Now, growing up, I always thought the Old Testament was strictly about the story of the Jews and the Hebrews. And he basically said the main figure in the Old Testament, although not mentioned by name, is Jesus Christ. And then Jesus went on to explain this to his disciples after his resurrection. Well, actually, we know the Bible is the basis for all three major world religions, Christianity, Islam, and Judaism. And it's very interesting to see what different people think of who are the most important or famous people in the Bible or the Old Testament. And what I'd like to do is limit my discussion to some of the main characters in what we call the 5 books of Moses. And I think what's important to realize, which is fascinating, that there's a direct lineage from the first person on earth, according to the scripture, Adam and Eve, all the way through to Jesus Christ and beyond. And I'm going to try to take this in some form of order and describe basically who they were, what they're basically famous for, and how it may be connected, how they may be connected to Swami's teachings. So we know the first man and woman was Adam and Eve. And their purpose to be put on earth was basically to populate the earth with descendants. But God made one major cardinal rule: obey me, don't eat the fruit from the apple tree. Well, you know, in the story, a serpent tempts Eve, and she convinces Adam to take a bite out of the apple. And, you know, individuals who were born, the firstborn people, did not come with any original sin. And when she committed this particular crime, if you will, this was the first representation of good and evil. And I think this is an important distinction. And even Baba says, you know, we're not born evil. There is no original sin, as I understand Baba's teachings, that this is something that humans develop. This is a tendency. So out of this, unfortunately, you know, this was the origin of disease, difficulty farming. You know, they lived in the Garden of Eden with no weeds. It was just a wonderful place. God introduced disease and animals became carnivorous. And this was the origination of painful labor. So Adam lived to be 900 years old. And you see all these biblical figures lived for a very long time according to our own concept of time. So, you know, as we heard before, Abraham lived maybe about 5,000 years ago. Well, not really sure of that, because if you go back in time and you really trace the descendants, his predecessors, if you will, they don't go back to the beginning of recorded time for man's first appearance on earth. So what comes next? Well, as I said, we see that everybody is connected. So Cain and Abel were the sons of Adam and Eve. And what are they famous for? Well, Cain and Abel made sacrifices and to the Lord, and evidently Abel's was really accepted and Cain wasn't. And Cain, therefore, did the next best thing. He committed murder. He murdered his own brother. And when asked about that, Cain replied, well, am I my brother's teacher? Well, he was actually punished and driven from the land. But God did not punish him by killing him. And this basically tells a moral story that God is a loving God and still gave Cain the opportunity to live. Well, following Cain, several generations later, we hear of Noah. And Noah is famous for the story of the great deluge, where the earth was just flooded. And this also appears in the book of Genesis. And the patriarch called by God for his goodness to perpetuate the human race. Now, it's very interesting. When God gave Noah the commandment to build the ark and take 2 of every species, and he and his wife and children would be basically protected, it's very interesting that Noah didn't protest. He obeyed God completely. And it's really said, you know, that afterwards, that in some of the verses of the Bible, God really had second thoughts and thought that, you know, he really regretted creating man because of his wickedness. And it's very interesting that God would look back and think this, and Baba would probably say, well, you know, past is past. You know, forget about the past. Let's think about the present moment and go from there. So, you know, God allowed man to eat flesh after Noah's venture, which also lasted 40 days and 40 nights. And 40 in the Bible has very particular significance, because you'll see a lot of what is written occurs for 40 days or 40 years. People wander in the desert for 40 days, or the Israelites wandered in the desert for 40 years. So numbers are important. So God made a covenant not to flood the earth again and destroy humanity. And as a symbol of this pledge, he created the rainbow to serve as a reminder of this particular pledge. So Noah was felt to be one of the most important people in the Bible. And he was 600 years old at the time of the flood and lived an additional 350 years. Now, Abraham, we've all heard about Abraham. He was the major patriarch of the Jews. And what Ilya said was very, very complete. But even in the Bible, you know, there's a lot we read in Hebrew school about all the great deeds of these people. But somehow, when I was going to school, I didn't recognize that, nor would we taught, that these were just humans, and they had a lot of, how can I say it, difficulties with their own personality and character, which really isn't brought out. But it shows that God still chose Abraham to be the patriarch, and from his descendants, the founders of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Jacob was the son of Isaac and the grandson of Abraham. And Jacob was a scoundrel of sorts for many, many different reasons. He is famous for a dream of his where he actually wrestled with God. And this was symbolic of the struggle with the inner self. And God wanted to enter relationship with Jacob, but he couldn't do so until he admitted his wickedness of self-reliance, deceit, and trickery. So when Jacob refused to surrender, a divine touch on Jacob's hip forced the young man to surrender and admit his utter need for God. And this reminds me of Baba, because I look at the story in the context of Sai and say Jacob actually received darshan. And you might look at this story as a myth, and indeed it may be. It may be just a tale, but I have known people, and many of you know people, who have, after receiving Baba's darshan, instantly change their ways and are immediately transformed, or at least the transformative process begins. And because of this transformative process with Jacob, he then obtained the name of Israel. So by asking forgiveness of our sins and by entering a new relationship with God, a process of transformation changes everything in our lives, our thoughts and our deeds. And I think this is the first place in the Bible where the transformative process is even mentioned. He had a son called Joseph, and Joseph's story also reads like a novelette. Now, Joseph was felt to be the favorite son of Jacob. And this in itself presented problems. And Jacob made a coat of many colors for Joseph. His many, many brothers were extremely jealous, threw him in a pit, lied to the father what happened to Joseph. And at some point, Joseph was sold into basically slavery by a group in a caravan and taken to the court of Pharaoh. And it's a long, long story, but evidently Joseph had many dreams and he predicted many incredible things, years of famine, then years of plenty, or plenty and then famine. What happened was he found favor with the Pharaoh. Well, the famine also involved all of the land. And Jacob's family realized they needed food. Well, where are they going to get food? They had to go to the Pharaoh. So they went to the Pharaoh's court, and there was Joseph, and they presented themselves to Joseph. They didn't recognize Joseph. Joseph recognized them. And after a series of events, which are too much to go in detail, Joseph finally forgave his brothers. And so the story of Joseph is a story of redemption. And redemption is an extremely important part of the biblical story. What's also interesting is Baba says, what is bad for you turns out to be good for you. Well, what was bad for Joseph by being thrown into the pit and becoming a slave and then rising up in the court, he eventually was able to save his family, and vice versa. What was bad for the family, realizing that they had done something bad, and by seeking redemption, that turned out to be good, and they were shown favor in Joseph and the Pharaoh's eyes and prospered. We've heard about Moses. Again, Moses was a very imperfect person. In fact, he was very reluctant originally when God approached him at the burning bush to lead the people of Israel out of the house of bondage. And Joseph had very little confidence that he could do that. And he did it actually reluctantly. So we've heard the story of the Ten Commandments and how the Jews basically wandered. And I guess, you know, there's an expression, the wandering Jew, because the Jews have wandered, as you've heard in many of these stories, over times and even in the diaspora. So I think that's all I'd like to say about the major players in the Bible. And there are so many more, but I think these are the key personages.
Yeah, that's wonderful, Stan. You know, as you kept talking about some of these patronages, I started to remember some of the, you know, especially the 5 values, right? And I know how, as you got into more of the details of each story, it was pretty evident how there's connected back to some of the teachings Swami has done. And you beautifully and eloquently had connected those. So thank you again very much for being able to do that and connecting it back to some of Swami's teachings. Definitely appreciate that. So next, Ilana. So can you mention and describe the major Jewish holidays?
Yes, Sairam. There's a lot. So in Jude, I won't go into all of them. Like the history that Ilya gave is extensive, and the personages that Stan spoke about are extensive. And similarly, there's so many Jewish holidays. And I think very much like the Hindus, it seems like every other day is a holiday of some sort. So the main Jewish ones are, the first one is Rosh Hashanah, which is the Jewish New Year. And that's usually happens around September, October. And the Jewish calendar goes by the moon. So it's different every year. I think similar to the Hindu calendar, it changes all the time. And then there's a 10-day period between the Jewish New Year, Rosh Hashanah, and Yom Kippur. And those 10 days are supposed to be a time of inner reflection and really going within and trying to do inner work. And I tend to deviate a little bit off of traditional, although I learned all the traditional stuff, I deviate off of it a little bit. So I'm going to share with you a little bit of the other more esoteric mystical teachings of it. So for example, with, you know, just, well, let's say with the Day of Atonement, which is Yom Kippur. So it's a very austere day, and everybody's like in synagogue for hours and hours, and they don't eat or drink, and it's very exhausting. But I like to think of it more as a day of at-one-ment. So rather than atonement, which is about confessing sins and, you know, and doing all that, I prefer to think of it as a day of at-one-ment. So being at one with God or with your higher self. So I think if you ask Jews, they would say that that's the most important day. That's the day anywhere that I would say 99% of Jewish people will show up in a synagogue during that day. And I would also like to just point out on the issue of, you know, on Yom Kippur, people talk about sin and confessing to sins, and confession, which is something that made its way into Christianity and Catholicism as well. But the truth of it is, in Hebrew, the word for sin is chet. And there really is no such word as sin. In fact, what the word means is missing the mark. So if you're in Israel and you're watching a football game or soccer game, I should say soccer, not American football. If you're watching a soccer game, when they kick the ball towards the goalpost and it misses the goalpost, the audience or the spectators will call out chet, which is you missed the mark, you missed the goalpost. So it's quite a lot more of a tolerant thing than what we're taught traditionally, which is not so much focused on the sin aspect of it. So I just want to bring that in to do with that day. And then after the day of At-One-ment or Yom Kippur, so then there's a period of time where we get to a holiday called Simchat Torah, which is you start reading the whole Torah scrolls again. So you read the same portion in each week on each day, and it's very much of a ritual that you go and read all of that, but it starts again from the beginning with the book of Genesis. When it starts up with Rosh Hashanah, with Simchat Torah. And Simchat Torah literally means the happiness of the Torah. It's a joyous time. There's lots of dancing. I liked that holiday as a kid because they give you chocolates. So it was fun for kids to go there and dance and sing and get chocolates. After that comes a holiday called Sukkot, which is about, it commemorates the story that Ilya was touching on when the Jews left Egypt, and they had to be 40 years in the desert. So they had temporary structures where they lived that were just had leaves over the top, palm leaves over the top. You're supposed to be able to see the stars through it. And one of the reasons I like that holiday's message is because it teaches about impermanence, which is very much of a Buddhist teaching, because we're not in a house with a solid foundation where we can live for 50 years and we're paying real estate taxes and insurance, and our security comes from our home and where we're living. It's much more about the impermanence of life and moving on and having to learn to not become attached, which is also a big theme in Vedanta, just giving up that attachment to the material world. So I like that aspect of it as well. After that comes a holiday that I think is the most famous Jewish holiday, which is Hanukkah. And Hanukkah is the story of lighting a candle every single night to commemorate the 8 nights when the Jewish temple in Jerusalem was destroyed or attempted to be destroyed by, or violated, let's say, by the invading Greek army. So there was a miracle that happened where they thought they only had enough olive oil to have the candle burn for 1 night, but it turned out that it burned for 8 nights until they were able to press more olives to make new olive oil so that it would light. And the reason why it's important is the ark, which holds the Torah, which is known as the Ark of the Covenant, always has a light above it that is supposed to never go out, and that light is supposed to be for us to remember God, and for that the light of God can never go out. It's called the Ner Tamid, which means the candle that's eternal, the eternal light. Eternal candle. So it was important. It was an important miracle in the Jewish tradition because instead of it only lasting the 1 day as it was supposed to, it went 8 days. I think the reason why it has become the most famous holiday really is because it's associated with Christmas. And so people, I think, and I don't know, Stan and Ilya grew up with this, but the Christian children are always getting gifts and presents, and Christmas is a very huge holiday in every country, most countries. So I think that the Jewish parents started a little bit to introduce the idea of Hanukkah presents into the thing, although I never grew up with that, and it's definitely not anything part of Judaism for it to be a materialistic holiday at all. It really has got nothing to do with gifts and gift giving. it's got other little things like playing with the sivivon, which is that dreidel. Then the next holiday that comes along, I think it is called Tu B'Shvat, which is the holiday of the birthday of trees. And I like that holiday as well because it commemorates the trees in nature and brings us more into harmony with that. I also have a personal connection with it because the word for tree in Hebrew is Ilan. And so my name is an oak tree. Ilana means an oak tree. So I've always enjoyed that connection with the earth and with nature and with the trees. All right, then the last holiday I'll speak about, it's two, is Passover. And again, that one commemorates the Jews leaving Egypt and being led out by Moses and crossing the Red Sea, which was another one of those miracles where you are reaching a place where, you know, the expression you're between a rock and a hard place or between the devil and the deep blue sea. So in Judaism, they were between the invading Egyptian army of Pharaoh from the behind that Ilya was talking about and coming to getting the Red Sea on the other side. So it was like, well, what do? Do we surrender to this army and get killed, or we just walk into the ocean and get drowned? So personally, I like to think about that when I'm in a time in my life where things just seem so difficult and you're just wondering, how do I get out of this? It's so incredibly challenging. Then there is a time of just total surrender to God and to Sai Baba, to whoever your expression of God is, you know, to whatever your highest source is, and to just be, wow, you know, when I'm between this invading army and an ocean where I really feel like I've got no chance of surviving this, there always is a miraculous way out that we don't understand at the time. So from the time that that they crossed the Red Sea and the sea opened up, that was the miracle. The sea opened up and they were able to go through. And it closed behind them so the Egyptians couldn't cross. From this point, it was 7 weeks. There's 7 weeks until the next holiday, which is called Shavuot. And the word Shavuot comes from the word Sheva, which means 7. And it also, it's the time when Moses, Stan was talking about Moses, when Moses went up onto Mount Sinai to receive the 10 Commandments, the Torah, the Word of God. So it's a 7-week period. So again, I like to use this time rather than just the traditional. Judaism can sometimes be so many rules and laws that you've got to follow that I feel like sometimes they forget about the mystical and more esoteric side of it, which I personally love. And so between Passover or Pesach and Shavuot, which is the receiving of the 10 Commandments, that 7-week period, I like to look at it as the chakras, the 7 chakras. So we go from a place of the first chakra, the base chakra, which is bondage and us being stuck. And that is associated with Egypt, because Egypt was the place where the Jews were slaves to Pharaoh and slaves to the whole idea of being slaves. And we can correlate it to the whole idea of believing that we don't have personal freedom, that we don't have freedom at all. And the word Mitzrayim is the Hebrew word for Egypt. And the word Mitzrayim means constraint or limitations or boundaries. And we all get stuck in that in our base chakra. And then as we move out of that to the next chakra is the time of escape until we get up to the crown chakra. And we know the crown chakra is about our connection with the divine, our connection with God. So when Moses received the 10 Commandments and the Word of God on Mount Sinai, that's the elevation on the 7th chakra or the 7th week to have that oneness with God. So I think it's a very beautiful correlation of bringing in Eastern and Western teachings. And there are a couple of other things I'll just mention quickly about Passover, which I also find interesting. On Passover, it's traditional to eat matzah, which is a flat bread. It's about this big. It's kind of square and it's flat and it's very tasteless. But the idea behind it, again, on the more esoteric or mystical side of it, is that because this is all about giving up our egos and making that seventh chakra, seventh week connection with God, the matzah being flat is a symbol of us not being connected to our egos, to our ego self. So it's flattening the ego, deflating the ego, and having that experience of oneness, where usually during the year we're all puffed up like the yeast in bread. We're all puffed up with our own self-importance and our own, we all know how humans get and how humans are. And this is a time where for 8 days of Passover, you're eating this matzah and you're thinking about leaving bondage, getting out of this idea of constraint and limitation and Maya, deflating the ego and eating that flattened bread. So those are some of the primary, there are others, but those are the primary holidays in Judaism.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that, Ilana. Yeah, there's so many things that, as you talked about, the significance of each of the holidays, that I can reconnect to some of the holidays that I celebrated as a child. And even here, when I used to go to school in Chicago, I used to have a lot of friends, especially for Hanukkah. They used to bring dreidels to school, and it was very interesting to kind of share that culture and kind of see how it symbolizes similar things that we've learned differently in our lives. I think something that really struck me is the ego that you mentioned, the 7 chakras. Definitely, I think those are some of the principles of Hinduism, and it's very neat to see how it connects with Judaism and how each of those days and the significance they have. It's similar to some of the teachings that we learned from Swami as well. I know you also mentioned about sealing on desires. So that's some concepts that Swami had talked a lot about. So definitely, the more each of you kind of delve in more into Judaism, the more I'm seeing the similarities and the bridges between what I know as the person and what I've grew up in as my personally. So thank you so much again for beautifully explaining that and translating that into some of the words that Swami had mentioned as well. So moving on, I have a question for all three of you. So I'll state the question and then one of you can pick it up and we can pass it around. So can you describe your religious upbringing, or how did you get involved into the Jewish religious activities, whether that's here in the United States or in some of the other countries, and how that has shaped your identity?
All right, well, I'll jump in if nobody's going to speak. So I was raised Jewish, but I would say traditional more. So Judaism has got a lot of different, there's Reform Judaism, Conservative, there's Orthodox, there's Hasidic, there's a lot of different kinds. And I was raised more with the emphasis being on the family and traditional holidays. Like I described, the family would get together and celebrate usually there's a lot of food. Jewish holidays tend to be very focused on food and not so much on drinking, more on the food aspect of it. So Friday nights is a traditional time in my family. We would, on Friday nights, get together with my grandparents and light candles. And again, it's about bringing in the light into the home, and then celebrate my family didn't keep the Sabbath, which is you're not supposed to drive or work or do any of that stuff on Saturdays. My grandparents did that, but my parents did not. And I did not grow up with that, but when I was about 16 or so, I found out more about these esoteric teachings of Judaism that I was talking about a little bit before, and I'll get into more later on. But I decided I had such a yearning and such a quest and desire to know God that I tried to become more religious because I thought that that would help get me more to a oneness with God. It was something that I've always just longed for since my earliest memories. So I studied more and learned more about the Torah and did more of the thing with what's called halachic teaching, which is following all of these rules and laws. But it wasn't, and I did it for a while. I didn't even actually tell my family about it. I didn't tell them I was keeping all of those rules because my parents weren't that interested in the religious, like orthodox part of not driving, not doing all of this stuff. But in my quest for finding God, in looking for God, I should say, I was more interested in that. And that was for me a stepping stone, really, to start learning about other religions, to start learning about other philosophies, East and West and everything in between. But for me, I grew up pretty traditional, just in terms of culture. Israel is a very big part of Jewish life, usually, and I did live in Israel for a couple of years, and I lived in a kibbutz, which is like a community farm, and I learned Hebrew, and so anyway, that's kind of my upbringing.
Wonderful. That's so insightful to see that. Ilya, you want to share?
I'll go next, and it's very delightful to hear that Ilana, grew up here and lived in Israel as well. And
actually, Ilya, I didn't actually grow up here. I grew up in South Africa. I was born in South Africa, and then I moved to London. So when I was a kid, my parents moved to England. So this is I'm not American.
Oh, it's delightful to hear that you were fully able to grow up in religious environment. And albeit I always was searching for God, just like Ilana, you mentioned. I was looking at every place, where people talk, or books more than people really. Talks about God, what is it? I was trying to find my connection. I was born in Soviet Union, religion, especially Jewish religion, was very much limited. So it's when my wife and I left the Soviet Union and went to America, that's where we started to go to synagogue, celebrate with wonderful holidays, and open doors to Jewish tradition to our kids. That's where it started, celebrating Shabbos, and you rest for 24 and then some hours. That's a wonderful tradition, so we saw, so that happened in 89, then we moved in. Jewish community here welcomed us. We started to go to synagogue. And eventually, I was honored several times, when on Yom Kippur, the highest holiday, I was honored with allowed to lift the Torah, for the whole congregation. So for me, growing up not in that Jewish upbringing and being able to join, this welcoming group, when people was inviting us, when we first came, people would invite us for Shabbos, they would invite us for holidays, to break fast on Yom Kippur. That was so touching, because we were no, relatives over there or anything, but there's such a sense of unity and and community in Jewish tradition here. So in Jewish circles. So that was very touching for us, because we came by ourselves, we crossed that border like Jewish people crossed Red Sea back, in biblical time. We crossed, from the ocean, from Europe, here to United States, by ourselves. And this warm feeling of community definitely was very, very important to us. And nowadays, when I joined Bible Fold, we go to synagogue on high holidays, but still we keep in touch with this almighty, invisible God, all the time. So that's my little story. Sarah.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that, Ilya. I think both your story and Ilana's story, they're different. I know you both have grown up in different countries, so it's interesting to see how you both have approached religion in that way. So it's interesting. Stan, would you like to share any experiences?
Well, I am at the absolute other end of the spectrum. I grew up in a Reformed tradition, and it was quite secular. My grandparents, on my father's side, my grandfather was a tailor, and he actually made cuffs for Emperor Franz Joseph of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And then he came to the United States. He was extremely Orthodox, kept kosher, wouldn't travel anywhere on Saturdays, lived in a small apartment. On the other side of the family, my mother's father was extremely secular. And as a matter of fact, when he started the first Reformed synagogue in Staten Island, New York, people in the community called it the Church of St. Maurice. His name was Morris Singer. And that's how we were perceived at that time. And it was a rather secular experience growing up. Yes, we celebrated some of the holidays. We enjoyed Pesach or Passover, Hanukkah. The neat thing about Hanukkah, you'd get gifts for X number of days for the duration of the holiday, as was explained. And, we did better than the Christians because they only celebrated Christmas one day and they got gifts on that only one day. So we were rather proud of ourselves. But otherwise, when I went to Sunday school, we learned from a book, I could remember, it's called When the Jewish People Were Young. And it was a very sanitized version of what was really going on. If you listen to the previous discussions we've had so far, you could see the depth of the Jewish religion and the symbolism, the spirituality. It was nothing like that. It was just stories of Abraham and Joseph and Moses and Daniel and David, just stories. As far as Hebrew's concerned, I just struggled to learn the Hebrew alphabet and struggled to put words together. Had absolutely no meaning to me. Our services, however, on Friday night were in English and in Hebrew. When I went to my grandfather's synagogue or shul, I couldn't understand what was going on. Men were davening, they were bending back and forth and moving around, and there was a lot of talking, and kids were throwing things, and it was absolutely chaos, and I couldn't even recognize it or identify with that. I'd like to say something about the synagogue per se, and try to explain that when you go into a synagogue, what all of them have in common, whether it's Reformed, Conservative, or Orthodox, they're rather austere. You've got the eternal light, and you've got the Torah in the front. and a pulpit. And basically, that is the essential of the synagogue. And it's this way, I think, throughout the world. When you go into many other churches, there's a lot of symbolism, and there's a lot of explaining. If you travel to Europe and you go to the great cathedrals, you could spend hours and people telling you stories about the different things that are there. But really, what does this represent? There's a God. He doesn't have a face. He's basically omniscient, omnipresent. He doesn't even have a name that you can say. You can't say the name of the Lord except one day out of the year. And you know, when we do the prayers, I just want to mention this parenthetically. At the end of our bhajan sessions, and we say, Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad. The word for God, Adonai, if you read the Hebrew, it doesn't say Adonai, it says something else. It's an acronym. Because God is so sacred that you can't even say his name. And again, there's lots of reasons for that. So my upbringing was that I tolerated Sunday school. I went to Friday night services. And when I went away to college, that was basically it. I just left the synagogue, and I married someone not of my faith, and attended Christian services, and now I'm involved with Unity. And the interesting thing about our Unity here in Asheville, and it must be a Baba Lila, when we went for the first time, the speaker mentioned Sai Baba. And this is the first time and the only time I had ever heard of Sai Baba outside of our own Sai Baba family, if you will. So I've been out of Judaism, really, honestly, if I said 55, 60 years, that would not be an exaggeration. Go ahead. Yes.
I was just going to say, pick up on something that you said. What's interesting in Judaism is you don't have to believe anything to be Jewish. You don't have to believe in God. You can be an atheist and still be Jewish. So Stan was brought up, he's saying secular. Ilya was brought up in Russia where they weren't even allowed to practice religion. I was brought up more traditional, not traditional, but I was brought up with free and easy access to it because my grandparents had escaped persecution from the Second World War and from the pogroms in Russia and Poland and Eastern Europe before. They found their way to South Africa. So we had that expression of freedom, although there was an enormous amount of anti-Semitism from the apartheid government who hated Jews and hated blacks and hated anybody who didn't look like them. So it was kind of like almost like the Nazi party in practice growing up for me, and that's another whole story. But you didn't have to actually believe anything. You don't have to practice holidays. You don't have to learn Hebrew. You don't have to accept anything. And one of the things that I actually enjoy about Judaism is that they encourage you to really ask questions. You're not supposed to just accept whatever's told you. You can debate. And Jewish scholars can make you crazy with the debate. It never ends. They can debate one line for a year, one line out of the Torah for a year. But Judaism is so varied and so different. And there's a joke. Jews tend to be very self-deprecating in their humor and are known for their sense of humor. Jewish humor is quite a well-known thing. So there's this joke that's about this man who was living on a desert island. He was stranded there. And after many decades, when he was finally, some people came on a ship and found him and rescued him. And they said to him, "What are those two buildings up there?" And he says, well, that's one is a synagogue, and that one's also a synagogue. So they said, but you're the only person on this island. Why are there two synagogues? And he says, well, that's the synagogue I won't go to. So there's this thing in Judaism, it's like, you know, I think it's a little unfortunate that people are divided up about which is the correct one or which is the one that they go to, and they become very almost territorial about it. But as Sai Baba says, we're all one, and it's the language of love, and it really doesn't matter what religion or which synagogue you go to, or even what you believe, or even if you believe in God. It's all about this inner journey. It really is only an inner journey.
Absolutely. And Bernie Sanders also said, yes, I'm Jewish, and I believe in Judaism, but I don't practice it. So that's to your point.
Yeah. Yeah. And in fact, in Israel, I would say most people in Israel are not religious. They're secular. Most Israelis are secular. So there's a lot of contention as well between the religious aspect of it and the secular aspect of it. So I think each person, like Sai Baba says, there is many paths to God as there are people on the planet. And we're each here to find our own way, our own path. And Swami guides us and teaches us. And I love that Sai Baba says, you don't have to have a picture of me on the front of your, you know, when we go to sing bhajans in your group, wherever people meet, you don't have to have anything. You don't have to have a particular picture. You don't have to have a particular ceremony or service. Yes, we can enjoy all the ritual, and Judaism has a lot of ritual, and Catholicism, Buddhists, everybody, Hindus have a lot of ritual, but it's only a part of religion. It's just it's an aspect of it, and there's no set thing that you have to do to be considered to be Jewish. It's for me, way more important is finding the inner connection.
Yeah, beautifully said. Yeah, I think the more everyone speaks about their experiences, the more I realize that, you know, there's this unity and diversity that we learn, and it's also quite visible from all of your different backgrounds and how you approach Judaism that way.